Well, hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be looking at the top 5 reasons as to why I use Windows Subsystem for Linux in my new development life cycle. For those of you who are not familiar with WSL, is a new Linux kernel that is currently being shipped natively in Windows from Windows 10 going forward. And this is a real Linux kernel, and for developers this has brought real dynamics into the way we write code. Specifically for me, I'm going to focus purely on Python projects, but some of the issues that I'm going to highlight are also issues that are now added advantages for people programming in other languages, specifically also programming for the web. So I'm going to look at the top 5 reasons as to why I love using the Windows Subsystem for Linux, why I think it's better for developers than previously where we had to use purely a Windows platform. And yeah, let's dive to number 1. So issue number 1, I've actually categorized them together, is so when you are looking at tasks, for example, with Linux, it's actually quite easier to run background tasks than it is to run on Windows. I mean, for both platforms, it's quite easy to do. But now the Windows subsystem for Linux, we can be able to use the actual Linux kernel to be able to do background tasks well. And these background tasks are also closely tied to cron jobs. And these are scheduled jobs that you can be able to run on the background. So for example, it's easier on Linux to write a script that runs a certain command on your app, perhaps every midnight or perhaps every 3 hours or every single day. And also, in my opinion, I think it's easier to do Linux scripts, that is bash scripts, than it is to do Windows-based scripting. And those are usually the BAT files, BAT files. I'm going to elaborate this further in terms of task is issue number 2. So when we're looking at services and packages, especially coming from a Python and a Django background, so there's issues of Redis, and forgive me, I have some junk text here that I need to delete. Anyway, so when you are looking at Redis, Redis is one of the core packages that help us write background tasks. Now, when we are doing Redis, it's quite complicated, especially on a Windows environment, and let me show that in a second. Now, I've opened here the documentation, and again, apologies for my 50+1 slides. And literally in the first steps with Celery, one of the things Celery requires us to do is to select a broker, and this is a message broker, and you can either use RabbitMQ, Redis, and we also have other simpler brokers out there. So for example, when you're choosing let's say RabbitMQ as a broker, there's the easier Linux commands to install the RabbitMQ server and also opening the ports if you're using Docker. But if you are using other things, like here it says, don't worry if you are not running Ubuntu or Debian, you can go to the website to find installation, for example, on Windows. And if I open this in a new tab, I'll find that downloading and installing RabbitMQ on Windows, and this is actually quite difficult for those people who have ever tried to do it on Windows. So if I come here on the right and say install on Windows, for example, they ask me that the only way I can be able to install, for example, RabbitMQ on Windows is using Chocolatey. Now, for those people who are familiar with, for example, like React Native, another Microsoft packaging system, instead of using like pip, another mainstream packaging system, here you have to install Chocolatey, and Chocolatey is the one that is going to take care of your RabbitMQ. Now, and here they're even saying that new releases can take a while, sometimes weeks, to get through approvals. So this option is not guaranteed to provide the latest release. However, the management of the required dependencies, they are maintained. So one of the things I don't like doing is installing my dependencies using Chocolatey, and this is also an issue that I've had also for React Native, especially when you are required to use Chocolatey as the Python packaging sort of index. It also tells you that there's other dependencies for RabbitMQ on Windows. For example, you have to use the 64-bit supported version of Erlang for Windows. And that they ask you that Erlang installer must be done on an administrative account. So these are some of the big overheads that whenever you are trying to do some of this stuff on Windows, it gets quite frustrating. RabbitMQ is actually even better. Whenever you try to come and use something like Redis, for example, as a message broker, it's easier to do it on Docker, it's easier to do it on Linux. However, if you try to install Redis, for example, I think here I have documentation and I can come to downloads. Installing Redis on Windows is one of the most difficult things you can ever be able to do as a developer. Here I have, let me try to see if I can be able to see installation. There's wget commands. This makes it easier for people using Linux. But I believe there's a way you can be able to download. Check the downloads page. I believe we can go to, not that one. Let me try to look at download. But anyway, the point I'm trying to bring across, so for example, if I just come and Google Redis Windows, there's so for example, the first result we find here is saying you can download a moderately out-of-date precompiled version of Redis for Windows, and this is thanks to a third-party provider. There's even tutorials on how you can be able to do that, but here they advise us to run Redis on Windows Subsystem for Linux. And if you go on Stack Overflow, there's articles upon articles on how you can be able to do that. For those people who have been able to hack their way, apart from using WSL, there's really some third-party hacks that you can do to run Redis, for example, on Windows. And this is one of the main reasons I love Linux. So coming back to the slides, there's another point that has been a pain point for me using Windows as a Django developer, and that's the issue of GeoDjango. For those who are not familiar with GeoDjango, GeoDjango is, I would say, a subset of Django that helps you write anything to do with maps. So if you're looking at map data, how to save points, how to save polygons on maps and map data, we use GeoDjango. I'm going to quickly jump into the Django documentation. And literally, if you come to the Django docs, you'll find there's a section called GeoDjango installation. Now, one of the first things you are required to do, for example, is how to install on Linux or Mac OS, which is very similar, or Windows. And if you come to Windows, if you come to Linux, literally these are geospatial libraries, geos, which will be very helpful, which is very helpful when you are doing geometries like drawing polygons and getting intersections between lines and other things that are done on maps or even markers. GDAL, this is a geospatial data abstraction library that helps us, for example, convert maps. Also when you are doing something like distances and stuff. GeoIP for IP-based geolocation. This is good if you are doing like a tracking service. PostGIS for the database and Spatialite. So if you find, like, for Debian and Ubuntu, for you to install this, you just use this command. One of my first biggest project that I ever did as a developer was actually GeoDjango based, and I did it on Windows. And I'm going to try and find a screenshot from my notebook. I literally had to write step-by-step procedure for like 2 pages, and I had to do trials and errors for like 50 times. So if you come for Linux, you just run that command. But doing this on Windows, I believe, on Windows is quite complicated. So first of all, you install CyclePG2. That's tough on Windows because you have to install the pip install, and you also have to download the Windows installer, and it has its own problems with setting some paths. The OSGeo4W file, I found that there's different installers. There's some that work and some that don't work. The last time I checked, the latest installer was only working up to Django, I think 3.5. Beyond that, it was breaking everything. And then you have to do all these sort of settings, and they keep changing sometimes. Then you have all these issues that you have to do administrator privileges. If you go to a new computer, you need to upgrade all of these routes. So that's one of the biggest challenges that I ever saw. And there's actually a nice meme. Let me try and find it. There's a nice meme called one does not pip install GDAL. So one of the biggest thing, so like you can see from Stack Overflow, is one of the biggest reasons. But if you come to images, there's this meme, I've seen people make talks about it. One does not simply pip install GDAL, because if you've tried using this on Windows, is one of the most frustrating things that you can ever do as a developer. So with Linux, I'm able to quite easily do this. Going back to the slides, there's issues of WeasyPrint. So for those who don't know, WeasyPrint is a package that helps you write PDF files using Python or Django. So this is where your backend or your Python code is able to generate PDF, and this is instrumental in when you are doing like receipt systems, or if you are generating documents or report or financial statements. So of late, I've been working on on a project that is generating receipts, for example, for transactions. And one of the main challenges with WeasyPrint, let's see if I can be able to Google that. Sorry. I'm just going to Google again, so sorry for my WeasyPrint Windows. So it's also one of the most difficult things that you can ever do, and you can see even just Googling that, you see WeasyPrint not working with Windows 7 and Python 3.6. So there's a nice article here. Even somebody has written, WeasyPrint converts HTML including images to PDF using Python. It's cross-platform, but Windows requires a decent amount of massaging to persuade it to work. I've tried setting up WeasyPrint on Windows, and it's one, especially in this dependency called Cairo, is one of the most frustrating things that you'll ever do. On Linux is quite easy actually. For Linux, you run this command only, and everything works out of the box. But as you are coming to do on Windows, they even greet you well. They tell you, dear Windows user, please follow these steps carefully. And now there's a curated step, series of steps that you're supposed to do. You're supposed to install GTK libraries from GIMP. GIMP is a company that makes software editing for images. And you also have they also tell you that outdated GTK libraries on any Windows version you like, but if you decide to do that, you're on your own. Don't even try to report an issue. Kittens will die because of you. So imagine even on documentation where you are told you are completely on your own, and don't even try to bother the developers, because installing such kind of things on Windows is quite difficult. And this is something that I've started doing quite a lot in my project. So it becomes quite frustrating on trying to install some of these basic things on Windows. So there's also a lot of other packages that I've found. In my experience, if you are developing on Python, it's easier to do either on Mac or Linux, and in Windows is a complete nightmare. So these are three on top of my head, but I'm sure there's much more packages that work with Linux and Mac OS and not Windows. The third, I think, advantage of using Windows Subsystem for Linux is when we are thinking about deployment and environment. So you find, I think, in my opinion, over 90% of all websites on the planet run on Linux. So at the end of the day, all the code that we write, whether you are writing it on a MacBook, Mac OS, or you are doing out of Windows, at the end of the day, your code will live somewhere on a Linux server. So, and on Linux servers, there's, you know, issues like of Nginx, there's issues of Nginx, there's scripts that we use like supervisor, and also the deployment environment is quite similar. So I found this advantage that I can be able to replicate my online packaging and environment locally. And in Windows, for example, it's difficult to set Nginx and supervisor. Supervisor is a package that helps you restart your web app in event it crashes, or something like Gunicorn crashes. And supervisor comes pre-installed with Windows 2.7, which a lot of online Linux servers come pre-installed with you know, Linux 2.7. So I'm able to replicate my online Linux server locally with all the dependencies, and that makes it easier. So when you're talking about environment, this is also something quite interesting. So that means my local Linux environment of packages is going to be quite identical to what is on the live server. Another challenge that I found is when you're coming to relative paths, that in terms of Python packaging. So there's this interesting video that I'm going to pop up for a second. So I've opened up this repository that was done by one of developers I really respect. He's called Justin Mitchell. Check his YouTube channel called Coding for Entrepreneurs. So for example, when you're trying to glue Django and React together, there's like three approaches that you can take. And Justin's approach is where Django is used to serve up an index.html that then serves the React frontend. And so you'll find in one of the workflows that you can be able to do that is build custom scripts in your package.json that copies your collect static, for those who are familiar with Django, and copying build files to another folder that then Django is able to understand. So you find like when you're working with OS X or when you're working with Linux, these commands work perfectly well. But if you are working on a Windows environment, you have to use different regex commands, because the way Linux does its folder structures and calling relative paths is very different from Windows. So you find like for me initially, every React project that I was serving with Django, I had to write this on Windows. Then at the time where I want to deploy, I had to change all my code to match something like this. So you find that that is a real headache when you're doing deployments, where you have to change something because you are using Windows, and Linux won't be able to understand that. Again, this is a very good example of why you need to standardize your deployment environment so that they are quite similar. Okay, so going forward on the fourth issue is security testing. So of late, I've been experimenting a lot with web penetration testing. That's where I'm testing my web apps for possible exploitation from hackers. So you are doing a lot of penetration testing, API testing, you are trying to do SQL injections, and there's great tools out there. For example, something like Metasploit, which is, you can also run Metasploit on Linux as well as Windows, same as Babsuit. But with Windows Subsystem for Linux, I can be able to install Kali Linux directly on my Windows machine, and I can be able to do a lot of this testing directly from my Linux environment, because Kali Linux is specifically made for security testing. So there's tools like Fuzz API, which you can use to try to penetrate or exploit the APIs that you've written. And I'll show you a quick list of penetration testing tools. So for example, if I want to use something like Nmap, which is very famous for network mapping tool, so that I can be able to check my system, or Netcat, or let me go to another popular one, OpenVAS. So these are all supported in Linux because, as we all know, Linux is the best operating system when it comes to security, and some of these tools I cannot be able to run them on Windows, so it makes it easier for me to have my environment in the Windows subsystem for Linux, because so I can come to the Windows Play Store and I can be able to download Kali Linux on my local machine. Again, there's online videos that do a step-by-step tutorial. It's quite easy to install Kali Linux and to do the testing, and this makes it even more easier to do that. Initially we were depending on VirtualBox to install a Linux environment, but now I can just pop my Ubuntu, for example, and from here I'm able to access all my Linux commands. Cool. The next thing in our checklist is SSH. So this is particularly good for people who are deploying their code. So initially we had to use a third-party tool called Putty or Putty, depending on how you pronounce it. And I was not a big fan of Putty for accessing my web servers and doing SSH. Literally now it's quite easy. I can come to my Ubuntu here, and if I can be able to, first of all, let me clear my terminal, maximize this. Can be able to maximize, and literally I can be able to SSH to one of my servers. So for example, I have this server here, and ideally it's asking me to enter a passphrase, because I've also put public and private keys to log into my server, and this is quite easy because now I just have to enter my password. And yes, and now I'm logged into my online server, and that is the IP address. And now SSH has become quite easy, especially when I'm doing deployments. It's quite easy because I can just do it from my terminal. I also don't have to do my username on the terminal, on the server, because it's already prefixed here on my server. So doing SSH stuff not only for server but also for Git. Now instead of using a Git bash, which you used to install previously on Windows, now you can just use WSL to manage your servers quite easily. And finally, guys, if you're finding me for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to my channel and follow me on the various social media. And this is a typo, this is N, not a B, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.